and use of religion to legitimate both denouncing the other, you know, as well as engaging in violence, with the other. You remember, I think it was last year when Netanyahu picked a particular word that comes out from the Old Testament and a particular situation in which God commands action and basically winds up saying that these people aren't really fully human. They're half animal and half human. And Netanyahu used that term, as did the more militant supporters, religious supporters that he has. That doesn't represent, what mainstream Jews, believe, historically, etc.
Mm,
But religion is can be a potent factor.
mm. Yeah, and it's not good to use the very extreme examples to sort of tar the whole religion with that brush of being violent and so on and so forth. And on that topic, another argument from those who are quite anti-Islam, or quite anti-Islam, is sort of free speech. There's some incompatibility with Islam and free speech, and in the UK, a big debate was around blasphemy laws. They say because of Islam, we start to get blasphemy laws, and there was a big kerfuffle with this man who burnt the Quran and he got beaten up. And I think we have independent MPs currently talking about blasphemy laws. So another talking point is that Islam is incompatible with freedom of speech.
You should mention that those MPs are Muslim.
Yeah, sorry. So those four independent MPs, they're also Muslim, and apparently they were discussing, blasphemy laws, which for this country is something that is not done, and people were complaining about it. So yeah, that's another talking point. I just wondered how you see that, or if you think that's true, or is it just completely false, or
Well, the fact is, for many believers um, of all faiths, for many Christians, um, blasphemy, for example, would be seen as offensive or unacceptable. That's different than saying that one is going to advocate that there be a law,
mm,
against what would be called blasphemy. But are people offended? Whether they're Christians, Jews, or Muslims, when one is denouncing, one's faith, and there can be a move on that, and that can be also a problem when you do have a faith where you have a dominant religion historically. In other words, in Christian countries,
mm,
or in, if you will, in Muslim countries. Here I'm talking about, where you've got government also, with that kind of representation. But, the idea you know, of simply saying that there's something, peculiar about people being offended, or people not wanting to see a certain action taking place. That's one thing. If they want to say that they identify that they're in, let's say, among mainstream Muslims, that mainstream Muslims are somehow militantly, desirous of forcing and passing blasphemy laws, to suit their, you know, th there's no basis for that.
I
mm,
guess the underlying point is to say that Islam has this underlying unacceptance that we have here in the West. They mention these Christian values where we accept free speech, and there's this feeling that we're tolerant, and these guys that are not tolerant are going to come here and just take advantage of our kindness. But on this blasphemy point, like for example in France, I'm pretty sure they have blasphemy laws for the Jews.
mm.
So is the blasphemy thing just necessarily Islam? Can it be applied to any religion? you know?
Mm.
Yeah.
Historically, if one were to look at, for example, the history of Christianity, historically, uh, certainly in Christian empires and Christian countries, blasphemy would have been unacceptable.
Mm.
And in many countries where you would have a predominant religion, historically in many of them, blasphemy would be unacceptable. Now, when you move to the modern state, as it were, or the modern democratic state, then you're in a different context.
Mm.
It's a different situation, where we emphasize, if you will, pluralism, political pluralism, as well as religious pluralism.
Mm.
So, if one wants to say, gee, there are conservative Muslims who would like to see a blasphemy law passed, because, well, there are conservative Christians that if it weren't that you wind up having a country that has a pluralistic government, or in terms of its laws and its regulations, uh, you would wind up with some people who would like to see their faith not touched. You know, uh, uh, there's years and years ago, for example, when I was growing up, let's say in say America pluralistic, but years and years ago, if you had a film or an art exhibit that was seen as presenting Jesus in a very offensive way, okay, you would have had people who would have picketed the movie house. You would have had people who would, etc. Uh, and you would have people who would be, uh, more, as it were, more visibly condemning these things. I remember when we talk about some of this, I remember talking to a close Muslim friend of mine who created and used to head a major Muslim organization in America. And we were talking, and he was talking about the way in which the Prophet Muhammad is vilified, you know, um, you know, by others. Okay, and he said to me, he said, I can't do that in return because Jesus is a prophet for me.
Mm.
Moses is a prophet. In fact, he said to me, I have a son named Isa, Jesus, and a son named Musa, Moses.
Oh.
So, you see, and yet in New York on some, on radio shows you might have heard, or in political, in other political venues, there would have been just an ignorance of this and just basically, a kind of militant interpretation.